Hello, good evening and welcome. This is Sunday School for Sunday the 25th of April and it's 1 Kings chapter 15. I hope you're all continuing to seek God and His will in your life because that's what this continuing series is really all about. In this week's passage, Israel and Judah continue in idolatry and reap the consequences. It's not a good time in the history of the Israelites. Pause the video and turn your Bible to 1 Kings chapter 15. Okay, and I'm reading from the English Standard Version. Now in the 18th year of King Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, Abijam began the reign over Judah. He reigned for 3 years in Jerusalem. His mother's name was Maachah, the daughter of Abishalom, and he walked in all the sins that his father did before him, and his heart was not wholly true to the Lord his God, as the heart of David his father was. Nevertheless, for David's sake, the Lord his God gave him a lamp in Jerusalem, setting up his son after him, and establishing Jerusalem. Because David did what was right in the eyes of the Lord, and did not turn aside from anything that he commanded him all the days of his life, except in the matter of Uriah the Hittite. Now there was a war between Rehoboam and Jeroboam all the days of his life. The rest of the acts of Abijam and all that he did, are they not written in the book of Chronicles of the kings of Judah? And there was war between Abijam and Jeroboam, and Abijam slept with his fathers, and they buried him in the city of David, and Asa his son reigned in his place. In the 20th year of Jeroboam king of Israel, Asa began to reign over Judah, and he reigned 41 years in Jerusalem. His mother's name was Maachah, the daughter of Abishalom, and Asa did what was right in the eyes of the Lord, as David his father had done. He put away all the male cult prostitutes out of the land, and removed all the idols that his fathers had made. He also removed Maachah his mother from being queen mother, because she had made an abominable image for Asherah. And Asa cut down her image and burned it at the brook Kidron. But the high places were not taken away. Nevertheless, the heart of Asa was wholly true to the Lord all his days, and he brought into the house of the Lord the sacred gifts of his father, and his own sacred gifts, silver, gold, and vessels. Now there was a war between Asa and Baasha, king of Israel, all their days. Baasha, king of Israel, went up against Judah and built Ramah, that he might permit no one to go in or come out to Asa, king of Judah. So Asa took all the silver and gold that were left in the treasures of the house of the Lord and the treasures of the king's house, and gave them into the hands of his servants. And King Asa sent them to Benhadad, the son of Trebinmon, son of Hizion, the king of Syria, who lived in Damascus, saying, Let there be a covenant between me and you, as there was between my father and your father. Behold, I am sending you a present of silver and gold. Go, break your covenant with Baasha, king of Israel, that he may withdraw from me. And Benhadad listened to King Asa, and sent the commanders of his armies against the cities of Israel, and conquered Ijon, Dan, Abel-Bethmaachah, and all Chinneroth, and all the land of Naphtali. And when Baasha heard of it, he stopped building Ramah, and lived in Tirzah. Then King Asa made a proclamation to all Judah. None was exempt, and they carried away the stones of Ramah and its timber, with which Baasha had been building, and with them King Asa built Geba of Benjamin and Mizpah. Now the rest of the acts of Asa, all his might, and all that he did, and the cities that he built, are they not written in the book of Chronicles of the kings of Judah? But in his old age he was diseased in his feet, and Asa slept with his fathers, and was buried with his fathers in the city of David his father, and Jehoshaphat his son reigned in his place. Nadab, son of Jeroboam, became to reign over Israel. And in the 2nd year of Asa king of Judah, he reigned over Israel 2 years. He did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, and walked in the way of his father, and in his sin he made Israel to sin. Baasha the son of Ahijah of the house of Issachar conspired against him, and Baasha struck him down at Gibbethon, which belonged to the Philistines, for Nadab and all Israel were laying siege to Gibbethon. So Baasha killed him in the 3rd year of Asa king of Judah, and reigned in his place. And as soon as he was king, he filled all the house of Jeroboam. He left to the house of Jeroboam not one that breathed, until he had destroyed it, according to the word of the Lord that he spoke by his servant Ahijah the Shilonite. It was for the sins of Jeroboam that he sinned, that he made Israel to sin, and because of the anger that he provoked the Lord, the God of Israel. Now the rest of the acts of Nadab and all that he did, are they not written in the book of Chronicles of the kings of Israel? And there was war between Asa and Baasha, king of Israel, all their days. In the 3rd year of Asa king of Judah, Baasha the son of Ahijah began to reign over all Israel at Tirzah, and he reigned 24 years. He did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, and walked in the way of Jeroboam, and in his sin he made Israel to sin. This passage covers many years of history, and all we have here are sort of edited highlights. We are repeatedly told that the full story is in the book of Chronicles, and I will refer to that as we go through. But basically, if you read 2nd Chronicles from about chapter 11 through to about chapter 16, it covers much of the same period and gives a lot more detail. Now Abijam, the son of Rehoboam, only reigned 3 years, perhaps an indicator that God didn't bless his reign. If we look at 2nd Chronicles 13, we learn that Abijam knew something of the Lord and knew how to preach, but he did not uproot the idolatry and sexual immorality that was introduced by Rehoboam. This was the real problem with Abijam's reign, this lack of a real personal relationship with God. 2nd Chronicles 13 tells us how there was war between Jeroboam of Israel and Abijam of Judah. Abijam incidentally is called Abijah in 2nd Chronicles. And it also tells how Abijam challenged Jeroboam on the basis of righteousness and faithfulness to God. Jeroboam responded with a surprise attack, and the victory seemed certain for Israel over Judah. But Abijam cried out to the Lord, and God won a victory for Judah that day. Chronicles spells his name Abijah, which means Yahweh is my father. Kings spells the name Abijam, which means my father is Yam. Yam was the Canaanite sea god. Perhaps he started out as Abijah, the follower of Yahweh, and ended up as Abijam, the follower of a false god. It certainly seems that Abijam started out with the knowledge of God, but drifted back into idolatry and false gods. Meanwhile, Asa, the great grandson of Solomon, has taken the throne of Israel, the throne of Judah, after Jeroboam's reign in Israel and after his father's brief reign in Judah. The kings of Judah were usually measured against David, the founder of the dynasty. In contrast to his father Abijah, Asa followed in the same heart as David. The phrase, his father David, shows us that in Hebrew literature the word father can be used to speak of an ancestor in general, instead of strictly referring to one's father. After all, David was actually the great-great-grandfather of Asa. Now Asa was pretty swift to deal with some things. He banished the homosexual idol temple prostitutes that were introduced into Judah during the reign of Rehoboam. Asa's father Abijam didn't remove these perversions and idols, but Asa did. Interestingly, he also removed Makkah, his grandmother, from being the queen mother because she made an obscene image of Asherah. Now, Asherah was a pagan god of fertility, and we can only imagine what sort of image this was. It demonstrates a thoroughness of Asa's reforms. He was able to act righteously even when his own family was wrong, and particularly his own grandmother. Now, Makkah was apparently the daughter of Uriel of Gibeah and Tamar, and therefore the granddaughter of Absalom, David's rebellious son. Now, the image is described as obscene in our English translation, but the Hebrew word is closer to meaning frightening or horrible or abominable. However, considering that it was a image dedicated to the fertility cult of Asherah, it was probably some sort of phallic symbol, and I'll leave to imagination what sort of things they did with it. The remark about the removal of the high places, which is attached to this, is further explained in 2 Chronicles, from which we can deduce that the high places dedicated to foreign gods were removed, but not the high places that were dedicated to the Lord. In verses 16 to 24, we learn about the continued struggle for dominance between the northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah. Baasha gained the upper hand in the days of Asa because he effectively blocked the main route into Judah at the city of Ramah. He hoped this military and sort of economic pressure on Judah would force Asa into significant concessions. Asa took all the silver and gold that was left in the treasure of the house of the Lord and the treasure of the king's house. There can't have been a lot left because the Egyptians had already pillaged a lot of it. But Asa used this treasure to buy the favour of Ben-Hadad of Syria so that he would withdraw support from Israel. Apparently, Baasha of Israel couldn't stand against Judah by himself, because as soon as this happened, he actually withdrew from Ramah. Again, if we refer to 2 Chronicles, in particular chapter 16, we learn that this whole activity didn't please God. God was unhappy with the seeking of support from the Syrians, who were not followers of the Lord. And if we look at 2 Chronicles 16:9, that verse that we all know well, for the eyes of the Lord run to and fro throughout the whole earth, to show himself strong on behalf of those whose heart is loyal to him. In this you have done foolishly. Therefore, from now on, you shall have wars. That's the consequences. Continual wars, that's the consequences for their failure to follow God and rely on him. Take the time now to read 2 Chronicles from at least chapters 13 through 16, and you'll learn much more about this period of history, particularly how the Lord helps Asa win a huge battle against an Ethiopian army that came against him. And as we read on, we find that Nadab, this son of Jeroboam, did as his father did and continued the idolatry and hardness towards God. 2 Chronicles chapter 11 specifically tells us that both Jeroboam and his sons were responsible for driving God's priests out of the land of Israel. In this, Nadab directly shared in the sins of his father Jeroboam. I hope you haven't been too confused by talking about these two kingdoms in parallel. The dividing of the kingdom after the death of Solomon was the consequences of Solomon's behavior. The continued wars and things that go on are the consequences of both nations descending into idolatry. And even though Asa, when he was king of Judah, did actually bring the kingdom of Judah out of idolatry, he wasn't really quite as strict and thorough as he could have been. On the whole, this passage is a very stern warning to every reader. In these modern times, there are many false teachers and teachings to distract us from the truth. This hasn't changed. Right from the time of Solomon onwards, we find false teachings, false religions, and false prophets slipping in. Remember, go back even further to the days of Saul. It was Saul consulting witches and mediums that led to his downfall. Saul, of course, had fallen from favor when he failed to carry out God's instructions. Every one of these kings that are mentioned in this chapter, and in fact right away from Saul all the way through, we learn that once we start to compromise and diverge from God's way, we're setting out down a slippery slope from which it is hard to recover. Paul was very specific when he told Timothy and also the Thessalonians to test everything against what they know to be true. For us, that truth is the enduring word of God. God is consistent, he hasn't changed. His word, what we have as the Bible, is the final arbiter on all matters of life, culture, and conscience. It doesn't contradict itself, and God will not contradict his word with any instruction to you now. If anyone tries to tell you any other gospel than what you know to be true, then he can go to hell. That's Galatians chapter 1, verse 9. Jesus said repeatedly, you can check in Matthew 10:22 or Matthew 24:13 and in several other places. He said that the one who stands firm to the end will be saved. I pray that you will be standing firm with me, seeking God's will in everything. I pray that you'll remain close to God through all things, enjoying his presence and his blessing. Be blessed. I'll see you next week.